Star Trek Voyager was the third spin-off of the 1960s classic science fiction show Star Trek. It ran from 1995 to 2001. It was a show about a Starfleet ship, the USS Voyager, that was stranded in the Delta Quadrant and struggling to get home. In the show's seventh season, the show ended with an episode that accomplished this goal of the ship finally getting home. So, was this ending satisfying? Did it deliver on the promise viewers waited 7 years to see? In my opinion, no. The final episode of Star Trek Voyager, titled Endgame, I believe was a failure in every sense of the word, and I personally consider it one of the biggest disappointments in television history. In this video, I will examine the reasons why I consider this episode a failure, as well as the worst episode of Star Trek Voyager, and one of the worst episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise, and easily the worst series finale in television history. In fact, generally speaking, among Star Trek fans, the Star Trek Enterprise finale, These Are the Voyages, is typically considered the worst series finale in the Star Trek franchise, but in my opinion, These Are the Voyages is only moderately bad, and in fact, I would go as far to say that These Are the Voyages is a masterpiece when compared to Endgame. I know these are strong claims, so I will attempt to delve into and explain fully why I very strongly feel this way about this episode. I've seen others who were critical of this episode, but sometimes they come from the perspective of Voyager as a whole is a failure, and they just give this episode as another example in a long list of examples on why Voyager is a bad show overall. That, however, is not how I feel. One thing I want to make clear from the beginning is that I love Star Trek Voyager. It is in fact one of my all-time favorite science fiction series. Sure, it did fumble a lot here and there, and it wasted a lot of great potential. But overall, I look back on this show positively. So the perspective I'm coming from in this video is part of what makes this episode so exceptionally bad is that it takes a great TV show and gives it one of the worst conclusions imaginable. Oftentimes when I'm critical about certain Star Trek episodes, I'm accused of being nitpicky, and I won't deny that I do engage in nitpicking from time to time. However, in the case of this video, one thing I want to make clear up front is that I will not engage in nitpicking. I have seen other videos and articles that criticize Endgame that do engage in nitpicking as they tear apart particular scenes and pointing out specific flawed details. I will not be doing that in this video. In this video, I will be looking at aspects of the episode like structure, motivation, theme, and plot. In other words, I will be looking at the very fundamentals that an episode is made up of. The important difference from that to nitpicking is that nitpicking can be done for any episode of television, even really good ones, whereas examining the fundamental makeup of a good episode would reveal it as a good episode, and in fact help explain why that episode is so good. Likewise, examining the fundamental makeup of a bad episode such as this one will explain why this episode is so bad. On my channel in the past, I had mentioned in many videos that Endgame is among my least favorite Star Trek episodes. When I did a 5 worst episode list of Star Trek episodes, this episode was ranked as the number 1 worst for every list that it was eligible for. In fact, I once put together a compilation of all the different videos I did on this episode. But I have yet to make a singular video with the sole purpose to tackle this episode. Now, up until recently, I had a feature on my channel where any viewer could request a Star Trek episode to review, and I would do so, but I recently stopped that practice in favor of fan polls instead. However, the last review request I had pending was that for Endgame, which was requested by Carrie091. But instead of doing a typical review where I'd raise my voice and swear in anger, I decided to take a more analytical approach with this episode and fully examine why I believe this is the worst episode of Star Trek Voyager. So without any further ado, this is Endgame. why Star Trek Voyager's series finale is a failure. Part 1. The Structure. One of the biggest complaints of this episode at the time of airing from the fanbase at large was the way the episode ended, as Voyager travels inside a Borg sphere through a wormhole that led to the Alpha Quadrant, and then destroys the Borg sphere from within and is greeted by a fleet of Starfleet ships that then escort Voyager to Earth, and then the episode ends. We don't get to see what it was like for the characters after they achieved their biggest goal. We weren't given any indication of where they go from there or how they felt about returning to Earth or how they were received. In other words, through one event viewers had been waiting 7 years to occur finally occurred, and then the show ends without exploring these events in the slightest. I remember my own personal experience when watching this episode. It felt like a physical slap to the face when those ending credits started rolling. I was completely in awe and couldn't believe what I was seeing. A Voyager review blog I was fond of reading at the time, called Cynic's Corner, referred to this ending as a big up yours card from Voyager's staff to Voyager's viewers. And I once heard another critic refer to the ending as the producers of the show giving the fans of the show the big middle finger. And I can't help but look at these as accurate assessments. They certainly accurately describe my feelings when watching this episode. After all, the main goal of the entire show, as stated in the very first episode of Voyager and repeated throughout the entire series run, was to return home. So it was literally something fans of the show had been waiting 7 years to see, and when it finally happens, it's instantly cut short and given no resolution whatsoever. Now, I've heard the counter-argument made several times that they had they showed what happened to Voyager after it returned home, that would have been anticlimactic. I personally would refer to it as giving the show a satisfying ending rather than being anticlimactic, but that's just me. In fact, I can point to specific examples that prove this anticlimactic argument wrong, but I'll get to that later in the video. But it's obvious that the episode's intention was to show what it was like, what it would be like for Voyager to return home, but not be anticlimactic. And this would be done by beginning the episode with the segment that takes place in the future after Voyager returns home to give us an insight into what this homecoming would be like. In fact, I have heard others describe this move as a brilliant way to show us Voyager getting home without being anticlimactic, and I do think this was certainly the writer's intentions. However, I certainly wouldn't say this was successful, because they don't show us what it would be like for the characters that we know and love to return home. They give us a hypothetical future that is set decades into the future, where our main characters aren't even recognizable. And it doesn't even feature all of the characters, several have died at this point, and more importantly, this hypothetical future does not come to pass and is in fact erased by the end of the episode, and circumstances in this hypothetical future were different than how Voyager actually returned home. For one thing, this happened 16 years later, in which case many of these characters' circumstances would be entirely different. For example, in this hypothetical future, Torres and Paris would have a 16-year-old daughter instead of a newborn baby. 7 of 9 in that timeline was dead, therefore wouldn't have to worry about how she would fit into Starfleet, whereas in the real timeline she would, and Egypt would still be a younger teenager, and Harry Kim still a young ensign, and so on and so forth. So I'm sorry, showing us one possible hypothetical outcome that is in fact totally and completely different from the actual circumstances on how Voyager returned home does not at all make up for the lack of resolution at the end of the episode. Not at all, not in the least, not in the tiniest little bit. So the time travel aspect of the episode was insisted upon by executive producer Rick Berman, who stated time travel is really popular and therefore it needed to be included. In fact, Rick Berman wrote this episode along with fellow producer Kenneth Biller, who had co-written several episodes of Voyager and also directed a couple. But for the most part, like Berman, was more of a producer than a writer. Rick Berman was infamously known as a money man, someone who seemed more like a business executive than a writer. He took over as chief runner of the Star Trek franchise after Gene Roddenberry's passing. He was involved in some of the most celebrated Star Trek installments, such as Star Trek First Contact and the Voyager episodes Timeless and Hope and Fear. However, in those cases, he collaborated with other celebrated Trek writers, and in fact, the accusation has been made that whenever Berman got directly involved in storytelling, it was always to the show's detriment rather than its benefit. He is, in fact, was heavily involved with the writing of the first 2 seasons of Enterprise, which are generally panned by audiences as really bad, and he stepped back and was less involved in the final 2 seasons of Enterprise, which by and large are viewed as the best years of the show. So in short, Rick Berman is more of a money man rather than a writer, and it is said that for the writing of this episode, he and Kenneth Biller wrote the script for this episode in isolation for the most part, and locked the other Voyager writers out of the writing process and only consulted slightly with the head writer, Brennan Braga, who had limited input in this episode. So the argument could be made that this episode was written by business executives rather than creative writers, and the formula for creating this story was done by graphs and stats on what audiences wanted to see based on what had made money or got ratings in the past, rather than based on telling a creatively good story that stayed true to the themes of Voyager and gave it the satisfying ending that fans were longing for. So Rick Berman read the graphs and the studies and saw that time travel was popular, such as in All Good Things, the Next Generation finale, Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, and Star Trek First Contact. So the determination was made the episode had to be about time travel. It had to be about the Borg as well, because they were popular too. After all, First Contact made a lot of money, and Scorpion was one of the most popular, highest rated episodes of Voyager. And hey, why not throw in the Klingons too, because people like Klingons as well. In short, this episode was written as a formula of what is in and what's popular, rather than trying to be a good story in its own right. And that is why this episode failed to capture the essence of the episodes that they were emulating. Simply including time travel doesn't automatically recapture the magic of All Good Things, a script that was written and perfected with care and done so to honor the series that came before it and give it a satisfying ending. Nor does simply including the Borg automatically recapture the creative writing style of episodes like The Best of Both Worlds and Scorpion. However, this was obviously Rick Berman's mindset because, as I said, he's a money man, not a writer. In fact, many had accused Berman of being more invested in Enterprise and getting prepared for that show than writing for Voyager, and so the writing for Voyager fell to the side and played second fiddle. This was indicated by many interviews with cast and crew on what it was like when filming the final episode. In the 2 previous Trek shows, The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, filming the final episode was followed with celebrations and lengthy speeches and teary farewells that involved all the major cast and crew. Whereas with Voyager, Kate McGrew described them wrapping on the final scene and nobody caring. In fact, the crew immediately started disassembling the set to get prepared for Enterprise. No teary farewells, no celebrations. To me, this is a huge indicator on what the overall attitude was by the producers of the show of the ending of Voyager, that they didn't really much care and just wanted to get it over with so they could move on to Enterprise. And it certainly shows in Endgame. Now, there have been other critics that examine technical issues in the script that are indicators that the script was poorly written and poorly constructed, such as pointing out scenes like the scene in the future where in Starfleet Academy where Admiral Janeway is speaking at one of Barclay's classes, and how structurally this scene serves no purpose whatsoever. And also, plot elements are introduced and later have no relevance for the rest of the story whatsoever, such as Tuvok writing in a scene where he's freaking out in the future. This really reminds me of the film The Room, that is infamous for being horrible and has most notable aspects of that film is that it has many plot threads that serve no purpose and are introduced and never touched on again. And it appears Endgame also has this problem, albeit to a lesser degree, but still a clear indicator that the script was poorly constructed and lacks the skill of a professional script. It is evident that Rick Berman was simply trying to include elements that have been known to make money before, such as the aforementioned time travel in the Borg, but also the use of Klingons and Lieutenant Barclay. Included was the seemingly irrelevant side plot about Admiral Janeway trying to obtain the time travel device she needed to pull off her heist from a Klingon who she helped put into a position of power in exchange for the device, but then she is double-crossed. This plot seems to serve no purpose whatsoever other than adding a bit of fan service by including the future Klingons, which was another element lifted from All Good Things, and to add some pointless action, as there were several action scenes with the Klingons attacking Admiral Janeway's shuttle. Other than that, they serve no purpose, as these scenes could have easily been cut out of the script entirely, and you could have some other quick and easy way for Janeway to obtain the time travel device without affecting the main story in any way, shape, or form. And as for Barclay, Lieutenant Reginald Barclay was a popular supporting character known mostly for Star Trek The Next Generation, who had appeared in 3 episodes of Voyager prior to this one. Note to nitpickers, I am not including the second season episode projections, as that wasn't actually Barclay, but just a hologram of him and completely irrelevant for his function in this episode. So anyway, he appeared in only 3 episodes prior to this one, and overall would accurately be described as more of a Next Generation character rather than a Voyager one. And yet, despite not having appeared in the Next Generation finale at all, for some reason he's treated as a main cast member in this episode, despite only had appeared in 3 episodes previously. This is something I personally found really jarring, and is no doubt another example of Rick Berman chucking another thing that he thinks is popular and likely to get more ratings against the wall to see if it sticks, as Barclay's previous appearances on Voyager were always really popular. So now let me get a bit into the theme of this episode, as it's obvious Berman did want there to be a theme, and that theme apparently was that the journey was more important than the destination. And I can see why that would be an appropriate theme to have on Voyager, as this, after all, was a show about a ship journeying for 7 years to try to get home, but the show itself is about the journey, not the destination, so I do think there could have been a way for this theme to be successfully implemented in a meaningful way, but did this episode accomplish that? Not in the least. The way it could have been done in a meaningful way would be by celebrating the ship's journey that we've seen it make throughout the years, and exploring the impact the Voyager crew had not only on the aliens they met, but on each other. But the episode didn't do this in the least. Instead, the mantra of the journey being more important than the destination seemed to be used as an excuse to show that for the most part the crew wasn't really interested in returning home anymore, as they now saw Voyager as their home, and this is an incredibly horrible use of this theme, as rather than celebrating the journey that lay behind them, which is what any good series finale should do, it's just used to show that the crew is now disinterested in reaching the goal we were told repeatedly over the past 7 years that they were so desperate to reach. So for 7 years, we've journeyed along with characters who were lost and homesick and desperately wanted to return home. And shortly before they finally accomplish this goal, they no longer care. All this does is completely sap all of the joy out of the crew finally returning home, which should have been the most cathartic moment of the entire show. Instead, it came off as completely apathetic, and thus the theme undermined the main purpose of the episode. Part 2. The Motivation. So the main plot of Endgame revolved around the version of Catherine Janeway from 33 years in the future, whom I will refer to as Admiral Janeway, wanting to alter the past so that Voyager gets home 16 years earlier than it would have. As in this future, it took Voyager 23 years to get home. So Admiral Janeway had pinpointed a time that is approximately 7 years after Voyager got stranded in the Delta Quadrant to travel back to in order to help Captain Janeway and the Voyager crew return home. So she specifically chose a time where Voyager had come across a nebula with many wormholes. However, that nebula was infested with over 74 Borg ships, so Voyager deemed the nebula too dangerous and went on their way. Admiral Janeway somehow happens to know that one of these wormholes leads directly to Earth, so she travels back to give the USS Voyager enhanced defense shields and weapons from the future designed specifically to defeat the Borg in order to allow Voyager to safely enter the nebula so they can take a wormhole and return home to Earth 16 years earlier than they would have in her timeline. So, when Admiral Janeway tells Captain Janeway of her plan, the obvious question she asks is, if Voyager returns safely home in the future and they have these weapons that can defeat the Borg, why risk changing the timeline? So Admiral Janeway then reveals her true motivations for doing so, and thus the main motivation behind the plot of the entire episode. She explains Voyager suffered casualties in these 16 years, that 22 crewmen, including 7 of 9, die. And 33 years in the future, Tuvok's mind has deteriorated due to a Vulcan disease that he could have cured in its early stages had Voyager returned to the Alpha Quadrant sooner. So let's examine this motivation for a bit. So Admiral Janeway wants Voyager to return home because they will suffer casualties. 22 crewmen will die in the span of 16 years. That's double the time that they've been in the Delta Quadrant at this stage, plus 2 years. And 22 people had died in that time. So, out of curiosity, do you know how many crewmen died in the 7 years that the show took place? 44 crewmen. And that's only counting confirmed deaths on the show. It doesn't include many implied deaths that were never really confirmed. So that is twice as many crewmen that died in less than half of the time. So by those standards, Voyager actually did really good for themselves when compared to the first 7 years when stranded in the Delta Quadrant. They suffered half as many losses and more than twice of the time in these imaginary 16 years. So then, if that's the case, why then does Admiral Janeway want to leave these 7 years where Voyager suffered the most losses intact and instead erase the 16 years where they suffered half as many losses than they had in the first 7 years? Well, the only other reason given in this episode is that one of the people who died was 7 of 9, the loss of whom gravely affected her surviving husband, Chakotay, and don't worry, I'll get to this in due time, who was never the same after that and dead by the time in which Admiral Janeway is from. And the fact that 33 years in the future, Tuvok is dying from a disease that could have been cured had they gotten home earlier. In other words, Admiral Janeway is okay with twice as many people dying because none of them are her close friends. 7 of 9 and Tuvok, who, by the way, is still alive 33 years in the future, just keep that in mind, and because Chakotay had to deal with losing his wife. So in other words, this is one of the most selfish and self-centered acts you can think of. Admiral Janeway is basically saying here, screw those 44 people who died because none of them were my close friends. So let's examine some of these people that Janeway is leaving to die. First off, there's those who died when Voyager first got flung into the Delta Quadrant, including Lieutenant Stotty, a young Betazoid helmsman with a long career ahead of her, who knows what she could have accomplished. The entire medical staff of Voyager and her first officer, Lieutenant Commander Kevitt, who was her first officer, even if they had just met, Janeway should feel some sense of tragedy over his life being lost. And then there's the promising young Lieutenant Durst, who was brutally killed by the Vidians so he could have his face ripped off and applied to a Vidian creepo in order to try to impress B'Elanna Torres. And then there's Kurt Bandera, a former Maquis that both Chakotay and B'Elanna were close to and were deeply affected by his death. They described how he saved both of their lives on many occasions and how they were close to him and thought that he was a good man. And then there's Hogan, a trusted engineer who was good friends with B'Elanna, who saved lives on multiple occasions, people who would have died. And he ended up dying on a primitive planet that the Kazon stranded the crew on because of bad advice that Neelix gave him. And then there's Ensign Ani Jatal, who apparently was close enough to the senior officers of Voyager that they threw a birthday party for her, and her death created a feedback loop in the Doctor that deeply troubled and affected him because he chose to save his friend's life over someone he doesn't know as well. And ironically, this is a moral dilemma Janeway apparently would have no problem with whatsoever. And then there's Ensign Lindsay Ballard, a long-term friend of Harry Kim, who they went to the academy together, and apparently he was in love with her, and it was a death that Janeway deeply regretted. And also Lieutenant Joe Carey, the trusted assistant engineer whom was close to many of the senior officers and has been through a lot of difficult situations with the crew, and a father of two and a beloved husband. He died a mere few weeks earlier than the point that Admiral Janeway came back to. So had Janeway pushed up her timetable just by a couple of weeks, she could have saved his life as well. But apparently, she has no compunction of leaving two young boys fatherless and making his wife a widow, because she apparently has no compunction of letting him die. And all the others that Admiral Janeway has no issue with leaving to die. But just because her good friend 7 of 9 died and her good friend Tuvok will get ill, well, apparently that's worth erasing 16 years of history over, which could in fact have devastating consequences for the space-time continuum. Consider the butterfly effect. Admiral Janeway tampering with the timeline in such a way could in fact cause the destruction of the entire Federation. But who cares, because at least her good friend 7 of 9 will still be alive. But let's discuss the larger issue with what Admiral Janeway does, as what she does is exactly antithetical to what Voyager is all about, as it's been established in 2 prior episodes, Eye of the Needle and Twisted. The latter one only having been really recent, as it was aired in season 7 as well, where it was established that erasing the timeline to send Voyager home was a bad idea, and tampering with the timeline was not the solution. In fact, I find it incredibly ironic that in the 7th season, Chakotay makes a very powerful, heartfelt, and convincing argument on why tampering with the timeline to get Voyager home is a bad idea and is wrong. And just a couple episodes later, that's exactly what Janeway does in order to get Voyager home. However, the difference with what occurred in Endgame and what was proposed and rejected in both Eye of the Needle and Shattered was that in Endgame it's erasing 16 imaginary years that happen off screen, so to speak. Whereas in Eye of the Needle and Shattered, they would have been erasing the years we saw on the TV screen. Therefore, the viewer would feel cheated out of having wasted their time watching these events that then got erased. Therefore, by doing it this way, the viewer doesn't feel cheated because nothing they personally saw got erased. However, this does not change the moral reasons on why altering the timeline to get Voyager home is wrong. And the episode shattered the reasons given in there on why it was morally wrong to erase the events of the past 7 years and make it so Voyager never got stranded in the Delta Quadrant, is that Voyager saved the Ocampan people who would have died at the hands of the Kazon had Voyager not interceded by destroying the Caretaker Array, and also their 7 of 9 who would have never been rescued by the Borg had Voyager not been there. However, there are a couple more reasons not mentioned of the negative side effects of erasing those 7 years would have had. The people of Rakosia 5, the homeworld of the Rakosians, where billions of people lived and thrived in a vibrant society, they all would have been killed by the missile Dreadnought had Voyager not interceded. The entire planet would have been destroyed, so if you change the timelines that Voyager never goes to the Delta Quadrant, that's an entire planet of dead people. Also, the survivors of coal settlement would have been trapped inside a nightmare environment where they're held captive and terrorized by an evil clown had Voyager not been there to rescue them. And the Tarkarians would still be suffering under the oppressive dictatorship of a couple of Ferengi from the Alpha Quadrant had Voyager not interceded to remove these Ferengi. Also, the Ainarians would still be in denial about the fact that their ancestors had committed a genocide on entire peoples simply because they were different had Lieutenant Torres not been there to show them the truth. Also, the Nizu would have had their settlement destroyed by asteroids that an invading force was flinging at them had Voyager not been there to stop them. Not to mention, probably the biggest effect Voyager had, that all of the entire galaxy would have been purified, i.e. completely wiped out and killed by species 8472 had Voyager not been there to help the Borg defeat them and scare them back into fluidic space. That's quite a big one. Also, had it not been for Voyager, the Krynom scientist Anorex would have wiped out thousands of species from existence on his mad, never-ending quest to change the timeline had Voyager not been there to put an end to it. So that's quite a huge one too, as they stopped dozens of entire species from being erased from existence. Also, the aliens native to the Night Expanse would have been completely killed by the Malon, who were polluting their space until they died and didn't care, and they would have gotten away with it had Voyager not been there to stop them. And the band of telepathic refugees that Voyager helped escape the tyranny of the Devore Emporium, they would have been imprisoned or worse had Voyager not been there to save them. Also, the entire planet of Selena Prime would have been destroyed by a group of artificial intelligent warheads that were remnants of a war that ended long ago. But had it not been for Voyager, these warheads would have destroyed an entire population of an advanced society. Also, Voyager was there to stop a conspiracy on Quarren that was capturing innocent passerby ships and abducting their crews and erasing their memories and putting them to work in their power plants. A conspiracy that would still be ensnaring innocent passerbys had Voyager not been there to put a stop to it. And also, an entire planet of people would have died from a contaminated radiation because of their encounter with an old Earth probe had Voyager not been there to evacuate them to a safer world. So, you may be wondering why I'm bringing up all of these events, as it could be seen as defeating my previous argument on why Admiral Janeway didn't intercede earlier, but the real reason why I feel it's relevant is there are so many cases of Voyager being in the Delta Quadrant having a positive effect on the area, including saving 3 planets from being destroyed, saving countless species from being erased from time, and saving the entire galaxy from being wiped out by an invasion from species 8472. This and all the other examples I mentioned happened in a mere span of 7 years. So, bearing that in mind, there is no way in hell you could convince me that if Voyager remained in the Delta Quadrant for another 16 years, it wouldn't have any positive effect on the area nor the people they met, especially considering how much effect they had in a mere 7 years. In short, Chakotay's argument on why Janeway of the past shouldn't erase the last 7 years holds just as true to Admiral Janeway, who wants to erase the past 16 years. Surely she is dooming billions of people who Voyager would have saved in that time to die horrible deaths. And why is she doing this? Again, to save her good friend, Seven of Nine, and Tuvok. So not only are 7 of 9 and Tuvok worth letting 44 members of her own crew to die, they're also worth killing billions in the Delta Quadrant over, because hey, what are a billion lives compared to Janeway having her friends with her? And let's get back to what Admiral Janeway could have done, had dire consequences for the future, and she could have created a future worse off and more bleak than the one she left. And the main thing about that is she brought with her weapons and defense shields from the future made specifically to defeat the Borg. And she gave the Borg access to these weapons, who are able to examine them and find ways to adapt to them decades ahead of schedule, giving the Borg a clear advantage over Starfleet, meaning those many times that Starfleet defeated the Borg in the future, that Admiral Janeway is from, could have been undone. And because of what she did, the Borg may be able to win those encounters and be able to kill and assimilate billions of people. Perhaps they could even go as far as to defeat the entire Federation. But hey, having 7 of 9 alive and Tuvok having a clear mind is totally worth it, right? And for that matter, where are the temporal officers? You know, the ones we saw from Future's End and Relativity. As apparently there are a group of temporal investigators from the 29th century that monitor the timeline and remove anything out of place that could potentially damage the timeline, such as when Voyager was trapped in the 20th century and instead of the 24th century, these temporal officers interceded to return Voyager to its rightful century. And when they found a bomb from the future was planted on Voyager, they made sure to intercede to prevent Voyager from being destroyed. So where were they when Admiral Janeway traveled to an era she didn't belong to with ill intent to change the past and thus alter the future, which could have devastating effects on the timeline? By all rights, they should have shown up shortly after she did and been like, nope, you don't belong here, and they would take her right back to where she belonged. But taking her time machine away from her. But to be fair, these temporal agents are pretty inconsistent with all of Star Trek. But hey, they were established in Voyager, so it's only fair to expect Voyager to keep up that continuity. Part 3. The Borg. There's the classic saying that having too much of a good thing can be a bad thing, and many, including myself, believe this saying is very relevant when it comes to the Borg's portrayal on Star Trek Voyager. Ever since their introduction in the second season of Star Trek Next Generation, the Borg have been one of the most popular villains, if not the most popular villain, in all of Star Trek. Part of what made the Borg so intriguing was that they were a seemingly unstoppable villain that was nearly impossible to defeat. When the writers of Voyager decided to introduce them as a main adversary on the show, it is said that their intention was to do for the Borg what Star Trek Next Generation did for the Klingons. For a while, Voyager did use the Borg very well and in interesting ways, as they only used them sparingly and instead focused more on them through the eyes of 7 of 9, and thus you got a personal perspective of the Borg. And this went well for about a year and a half until they decided to introduce the Borg Queen in the episode Dark Frontier. After that, I would say the only thing they actually succeeded in doing is taking all of the dread and what made the Borg so scary and foreboding out of the Borg, so instead they became silly, almost cartoon-like villains who weren't to be feared, but instead came off more like James Bond villains, coming up with complicated, elaborate plans to defeat Earth when all they needed to do was send a fleet there to destroy and or assimilate Earth, and mission accomplished. The flaw was at its absolute worst in this episode, Endgame. Because in this episode, it was introduced that the Borg have a transwarp hub. In fact, they have 6 of them throughout the entire galaxy, which contains dozens of wormholes to all over the galaxy. So they even have one that leads directly to Earth. So this brings up several important questions. If they have these transwarp hubs that could take them to anywhere in the galaxy, why haven't they conquered the galaxy yet? Why have they only assimilated a small section of the Delta Quadrant, where they have these hubs that can take them to anywhere in the galaxy instantly? What are they doing? Biding their time? Waiting until the time is right to strike? What? Seriously, what is keeping them? And the other question is, if they have a transwarp hub that can instantly take them to Earth, why haven't they sent a fleet there? Because apparently doing so would be a piece of cake. In the past, a Borg ship has slowly creeped towards Earth, giving Starfleet plenty of time to mount a defense, and they always send one ship at a time. Yet apparently they had this ability all along to send an entire fleet of Borg ships instantaneously to Earth, and they never done so. Despite the Borg Queen specifically saying that she really wanted to assimilate Earth, and so they came up with plans like time traveling to the past to stop first contact, or setting up 7 of 9 on Voyager to be a spy in order to come up with this fancy bioweapon. So hold up, Goldfinger. Enough with all these elaborate traps, and just shoot James Bond in the head. Just send the fleet to Earth. Bam! It's yours. No fuss, no muss. In short, the whole concept of the transwarp hub is preposterous and spits in the face of all established lore about the Borg. Not only that, but the way they personalize the Borg's Queen's relationship with Janeway has a real cartoon-like quality to it. Particularly the way the Borg Queen says, "Janeway." It sounds like the way a cartoon villain would react to seeing their biggest rival. "Oh, you! Again, you are foiling my plans, you dastardly..." And the fact that the Borg Queen could consider Janeway a threat to be that interested in and what she's up to only makes the Borg Queen come off as weak and not this powerful, unstoppable villain that the Borg used to be. And for that matter, future weapons or not, having Voyager come in with armor impervious to all Borg weapons and the ability to just blow up an entire cube with a single shot really takes all of the sting out of the Borg and makes them come off as weak and ineffective, and in short, no longer the interesting, unstoppable villain that they used to be. Also, for some reason, for this episode, it was decided that Alice Krige would play the Borg Queen, who had not played the Borg Queen since the film First Contact. In previous Voyager installments, the Borg Queen was played by Susanna Thompson. And this allowed for an in-universe reason for this casting change that fans came up with to explain the difference in appearance in the Borg Queen. Since the Borg Queen in First Contact died with the rest of the Borg that infiltrated the Enterprise, it could be said that was a different Queen, and when she died, another Borg drone was promoted, so to speak, to Queen to make up for the loss. That fan explanation did have a certain logic to it and made a lot of sense. However, it all went out the window with Endgame because there Alice Krige was again, back from the dead. Now, I did heard some fans try to even explain this away, God bless them, by saying there are different models of Borg Queens, and this is obviously a different version of the same model that we saw in First Contact. But that explanation falls apart when you realize this Borg Queen is behaving as if she has already had a personal relationship with Janeway. So in short, all this did was make it very clear that this was simply a cast change and nothing more. The chance of an in-universe explanation was ruined by this episode. And I'm sure Rick Berman thought that it brought more gravitas or more importance to the episode by bringing back the actress that played the Borg Queen in First Contact, but in fact, she just felt out of place. And if Voyager wanted to stay true to its roots, which is what any good finale should do, then they should have kept Susanna Thompson, who is Voyager's established Borg Queen. Now, let's talk about the goal of the episode, because the goal of the episode was not to get Voyager home. It was, in fact, to destroy the transwarp hub. This was made clear in the scene where Admiral Janeway had a way to get Voyager home, but the crew elected not to go and to stay. Even Harry Kim, who was the biggest advocate of getting home, made a speech about how destroying the Borg transwarp hub was more important than getting home. So what's wrong with this, you may ask? After all, the episode itself tries its hardest to make a connection to destroying the transwarp hub and destroying the caretaker array. In fact, that was this episode's lame attempt to reconnect with the pilot episode of the series. But the issue is unlike the caretaker array. The audience has little motivation to care what happens to this transwarp hub. First of all, the audience had no idea that these transwarp hubs even existed before this episode, because they are in fact a construct of this episode, meaning by destroying them it takes the Borg right back to where we believed they were before. In short, it makes no difference. And as I mentioned earlier, the whole concept of the transwarp hub makes the Borg unrealistically powerful, so taking this away from them is not a big win. Rather, it makes more sense because it's removing a plot hole that should have never existed in the first place. And as far as comparing it to the caretaker array, in that episode we met the Ocampans. We got to know and care about them through Kes and her interactions with her people. We saw the Kazons and what big a-holes they were, so we knew the stakes involved, and with Voyager not destroying the caretaker array, that these innocent entire race of people would be tortured or worse and killed for their resources. But in Endgame, we never met any potential victims. They're just hypothetical victims of the Borg, whom the Borg will probably all assimilate anyway, because Admiral Janeway just gave them access to futuristic weapons. In other words, the goal is fake, and something the audience has no reason to care about whatsoever, as opposed to getting home, which is something the audience has 7 years of history that make them care about it. But instead of focusing on that, this episode shoves that aside for a fake goal to remove an unrealistic plot device that never existed before this episode. In fact, it reminds me a lot of Unimatrix Zero, as that also had a fake goal that audiences had no reason to care about, because we were just introduced to it and knew that it would never be touched on or mentioned again. In fact, I love how this episode tries to give a shameless shout out to Unimatrix Zero by having one of Barclay's students ask Janeway about it in the future, which he wouldn't have done because that would be a minor event no one in the future would care about, because it had exactly zero impact on anything. In fact, what they should be asking Janeway about is the Borg war with species A472, in which the galaxy was nearly completely eradicated of all life by benevolent alien species from fluidic space, and it also marks the first time that they actually helped the Borg survive, where the Borg could have been wiped out then and there, which sparks a lot of controversy and debate. But then again, Rick Berman wasn't involved in writing Scorpion. He was involved in writing Unimatrix Zero, so such a reference would fail to stroke his ego in the same way. In fact, I would even go as far to make the argument that the Borg should not have been in the Voyager finale at all. I remember when I first learned that the Borg were to be in the Voyager series finale, I was very disappointed, but a friend of mine said, well, of course the Borg are going to be in the finale, like it's a foregone conclusion, and I highly contest that notion. Now, it could hold true in the sense that, of course, Rick Berman would put the Borg in the finale because all he cares about is shoving in things that were popular in the past as opposed to doing what is best for telling a good story. Something good writers would have done is that they would have been more focused on actually telling a good story, such as a writer like Michael Piller, who was Rick Berman's partner for a long time and more of a storyteller. And you can notice a sizable drop in quality when he became less involved with Star Trek. Piller was responsible for writing what is one of the best series finales in television history. Not just Star Trek, but television history. The Next Generation finale, All Good Things. And the reason why I think the notion that the Borg were inevitable as far as series finales goes is faulty, because they didn't appear in All Good Things, despite the fact that the Borg were just as popular and just as integral to the Next Generation. In fact, they were originally meant to appear in All Good Things, as the original concept was that Picard would jump between 4 timelines rather than 3, and the 4th timeline would take place during the events of the Best of Both Worlds and would involve the Borg. However, when it came down to writing the episode, Piller realized that this storyline was not working for the overall story, and it only confused things. In other words, he was more concerned about what worked for telling a good story rather than making sure fan favorite moneymakers were shoved in there to ensure they get more eyeballs on the air date. And the result was an episode many considered one of the best endings to any show ever. No doubt, had it been Berman in charge and not Piller, he would have simply shoved the Borg in anyway, and thus we would be robbed of one of the greatest finales in history. Likewise with Voyager, had there been a champion storyteller that could stand up to Rick Berman without being fired and be like, no, we need to tell the best story for Voyager that concludes the character stories viewers have been watching unfold for 7 years, and have Voyager reach its long-term goal in a way that is satisfying and exciting for fans to see. That needs to be the chief concern, and if this can be done with including the Borg, fine. But if it can't, then the Borg should be left out, because telling a good story should come first. But unfortunately, no such champion existed, and thus instead of getting one of the best finales in history, we get one of the worst. Part 4. The Romance. It's been a bit of a tradition for the final episode of a Star Trek series to feature a romance between two characters that, barring a little bit of foreshadowing, had mostly been unexplored before the final episode. The Next Generation did this with Worf and Deanna Troi, and Deep Space Nine did this with Julian Bashir and Ezri Dax. So Voyager decided to stick with this tradition, and so for its final episode added a romance between Chakotay and Seven of Nine. So out of all these final episode romances, in my opinion, the only one of these that worked was the Deep Space Nine romance between Bashir and Ezri, because this was a romance a long time coming, as Bashir had had a crush on Dax since the very first episode. In the last season, they've done a very good job of playing up the chemistry between Julian and Ezri. In fact, Ezri went through a nicely constructed character story at the end of the season where she was learning to come to grips with how she feels and comes to the realization that she's in love with Julian. The Worf and Troi romance was a bit less inspired, although there had been some build up to this, such as the 7th season episode Parallels, where Worf jumped into a parallel universe where he was married to Troi, and the setup in that universe made sense as they had grown close ever since his injury and paralysis in the episode Ethics, and they had bonded over their love of his son Alexander. That made sense for parallels, but I thought was very poorly built up to, and the real universe and their dating and all good things did seem sudden and out of place, and was in fact one of the very few complaints I had about that episode. And the writers obviously noticed this mistake, as well as subsequent material very wisely did what they could to sweep this under the rug and pretend it never happened, as Worf went on to join the cast of Deep Space Nine, where he would marry Jadzia Dax, and Troy would go on to marry William Riker, the long-term romance that had been hinted at throughout the Next Generation's entire run. However, the coupling of Chakotay and Seven of Nine, I can say without a hint of hyperbole or exaggeration, was by far the worst, most fake, most contrived, and least convincing romance the Star Trek franchise has ever done in its entire existence. In fact, as much as I don't like this episode overall, upon my recent rewatch, I found the romance scenes between Chakotay and Seven of Nine the most painful and cringeworthy scenes to watch. When I was watching these scenes, something inside of me was screaming, "No, turn it off, turn it off, turn it off." In fact, if anyone wanted to torture me for information, they need not pull my fingernails or have someone rough me up. All they need to do is show these scenes of Chakotay and Seven of Nine on repeat, and I will break like an egg. I will tell them anything they want to know as long as they turn that crap off. I've never seen an on-screen romance less convincing, with less chemistry, ever before. The romance between Johnny and Lisa in The Room is more convincing than this one. It was obvious that the two actors, Robert Beltran and Jerry Ryan, were also similarly unconvinced by the writing of this romance, as their uncomfortableness about the lines they were forced to read came shining through the scene and was beyond obvious, as these two actors, who usually turn in great performances, were awful in these scenes, and it's obvious because his writing was so terrible. Now, I heard the opinion before that all romances between main characters in Star Trek have been handled poorly, and therefore the Seven of Nine and Chakotay romance is in good company and doesn't particularly stand out as being bad. And I could not disagree with this opinion more. I believe there are many examples of romances in Star Trek being very convincing and in fact very endearing, such as the Riker and Troy romance, and the chemistry between these two characters, even when they were just behaving as friends, was always very electric and palatable, and the show did a great job of touching back in and reminding the audience that these two do have romantic feelings for each other that they are suppressing in order to benefit their work lives. We see this touched on in episodes like Second Chances, and in fact this chemistry was so obvious to the fan base at large, there have even been a series of very popular Star Trek novels written about them called Imzadi. And this is why audiences found it so gratifying when these two finally did get together and got married in the Star Trek The Next Generation films. So this romance was a great example of a romance not only in Star Trek but all of television. And then you had the Picard and Crusher romance, which wasn't visited as much, but an undeniable chemistry always existed between these two characters. So whenever it was explored more in episodes like Attached and All Good Things, it was very convincing. And also, I would be as bold to say that pretty much every romance between main characters on Deep Space Nine worked, because Deep Space Nine was a character-based show that followed continuity and character development, and thus the romance in that series typically where the writers were noticing that two characters already have an established chemistry, and then they simply build off of that chemistry, such as Worf and Dax, who had connected immediately because of Jadzia's connection to Klingon culture, and became apparent that she was the only one that really understood him, and their attraction to each other in subsequent marriage felt really natural and only made sense. Likewise, the Kira and Odo romance built off of existing chemistry between these two characters, which existed from the very beginning of the show, as these two had a complicated yet very close relationship, and this was built up to nicely with an extended storyline of Odo having unrequired feelings for Kira, but it paid off when Kira, after being in a string of bad relationships, realized that the right man for her was in fact there beside her the whole time. That was sweet, and some of the most tender moments between the two of them towards the end of the series, I would say, was the best romantic scenes in all of Star Trek. Voyager, on the other hand, was never as good as creating convincing romances. Part of the reason is that, unlike Deep Space Nine, Voyager purposely avoided serialization and extended character arcs. So rather than building off an established chemistry that already existed, is more of a case of an executive, most likely Rick Berman, would tell the writers, I want those two characters together. And so they'd shove them together and it would feel awkward and unnatural, such as how they kept trying to shove Cass and Paris together throughout seasons 2 and 3, which just felt weird. And then there's the romance between B'Elanna Torres and Tom Paris, these two characters who had barely had any interactions with each other and no chemistry to speak of. In fact, it was obvious there existed chemistry between B'Elanna Torres and Harry Kim, but that was not on the exec's timetable or to-do list, so instead they decreed it should be B'Elanna and Paris. Now, I will grant that although these two characters had no chemistry or interactions before the third season episode, Blood Fever, ever since that episode they did slowly build on the romance and toyed with it throughout season 3 until finally paying off in season 4, so at least they didn't jump straight into it, which is more than I can say about Chakotay and the 7 of 9 debacle. However, there does exist in Voyager several cases where the writers did notice existing chemistry between characters and try to build off of this. One example is Chakotay and Janeway, whose relationship was explored in the episode Resolutions. However, ironically, I was very much against this when I first heard of it because it sounds like such a tired cliche to put the male and female leads of a show together in a relationship. However, the way it was explained and built so naturally off of their existing relationship made so much sense and worked so well for that episode. However, I completely agree with the writer's decision to then brush this aside, as it made sense that they would want to keep their relationship professional. It was only a relationship that was completely removed from the professional lives that they were willing to explore their underlying feelings, but once they were back in the working environment, they immediately had to bury those feelings deep. And I actually think that worked really well, as there was always this undercurrent of something deeper there between the two of them for the rest of the show, but something that would never surface again. So the more relevant example of Voyager creating a romance out of existing chemistry is the Doctor and 7 of 9. Their relationship developed naturally and nicely over the course of season 4, as the Doctor took it upon himself to tutor Seven in the ways of humanity, and being a hologram of himself, it was a way for himself to learn more of what it is to be human. And through these interactions, they naturally became closer, and the journey that we saw occur on screen completely and totally worked. This was explored nicely in the episode Someone to Watch Over Me, an episode that's generally looked on very fondly by fans, about the Doctor helping 7 of 9 enter the world of dating, and in doing so begins to realize the feeling he has for her. And the chemistry between these two characters in that episode was probably the strongest it's been between any two characters in the entire Star Trek franchise. And I'm not alone in this opinion, as this is something fans really caught on to, as the shippers caught on to the Doctor and 7 of 9 relationship, and many websites and tributes to this relationship was created. Hell, I even remember talking to someone I worked with who was only a casual viewer of Voyager and was not by any means what I would call a Star Trek fan, and he was very excited by this episode, saying, oh my god, did you see the episode where the Doctor hooks up with 709? So it's something that worked really well and really connected with fans because the writers built off of existing chemistry between two characters, so exploring the prospect of a romantic relationship only felt natural. To this day, Jerry Ryan talks about how she's constantly approached by fans who tell her they believe her character should have ended up with the Doctor, to which she replies she can't really argue with that. And when Endgame was released, there was a slew of angry fans that took to the internet to complain on how 709 should have ended up with the Doctor. One such fan complained about how the Doctor ended up with, quote, some bimbo, as a way for the writers to try to say, oh, it's okay for the Doctor. But I must say, I have to agree that this was a poor attempt to placate fans, to say, oh, the Doctor's going to be fine because he ends up with some random woman we've never seen or heard of before, 33 years in a hypothetical future that never actually comes to pass. So, for some reason that I still can't fully understand, Rick Berman was very strongly opposed to the Doctor and 709's relationship. In fact, the episode Someone to Watch Over Me was originally written to end with the Doctor and 709 entering a relationship, but Rick Berman overruled that and made the writers change it and decreed that these two characters could not be together. So, ever since then, the show has done its best to dismiss the Doctor's feeling towards Seven as juvenile infatuation, and on several occasions, it was actively mocked. And so when it came time to write the finale of Voyager, Berman decided that 709 should be in a romance, but rather than the Doctor, it should be Chakotay. And this decision was made not because of any existing chemistry between the two characters who, in fact, had very limited interaction with each other, but more in a bid to make Chakotay relevant again. In the past several seasons of Voyager, the first officer of the ship, who in the first 4 seasons was a very interesting, very fleshed out character, was becoming more and more shoved to the side and being severely underused and coming off more as a background character than a main character that he used to be. This is something the actor who portrayed him, Robert Beltran, would often complain about, and with good reason. To this day, he still talks about how his character was completely neglected by the writers in the final seasons of Voyager. However, one character who was front and center in the final years of the show was 709. So this contrived romance was nothing more than an effort to give Chakotay something to do. And the best they could come up with was tying him into 709's storyline, which is sad. Chakotay was an interesting and dynamic character in his own right and should have played a more prominent role in Voyager's final season as a strong first officer character that he used to be. Now, this relationship was slightly foreshadowed before the final episode in the episode Human Error that aired several months prior, which saw 709 exploring a relationship on the holodeck with the holographic version of Chakotay. Now, I dare say the romance here had just as little chemistry and worked just as poorly as it did in the finale. However, at least this could be explained away by Seven simply experimenting in the holodeck, and Chakotay's image was chosen rather at random, kind of like in Someone to Watch Over Me, where the Doctor and 709 came up with a program to calculate which man she should date, which was obviously flawed because it selected a man who was a nervous wreck, who was intimidated by strong women, the exact opposite of who would be compatible with 709. So I could see something similar happening here, but in Endgame it made no sense whatsoever and just seemed completely out of nowhere. And to be fair, there could have actually been a way to make a romance between 709 and Chakotay work. As much as I am fundamentally against the prospect of 709 ending up with anyone other than the Doctor, there could have been a way to successfully play this. Although Seven and Chakotay had had little interaction in recent years, the two were very much involved when Seven first came aboard Voyager. Shortly before the events that brought 709 aboard Voyager, Chakotay spent time in a community of former Borg drones, now separated from the collective, that formed their own sort of co-op where they all connected to the former drones, but in a cooperative community rather than a collective. and Chakotay was connected to this community for a short time and actually fell in love with one of its members. When 709, as a drone, attempted to assimilate Voyager, the way that the crew was able to stop her was by having Chakotay connect to her in the same way he connected to the co-op and tried to appeal to her humanity. This allowed Seven to be distracted long enough for the crew to disable her. Further, during the early days when Seven was first trying to integrate into the crew, Chakotay was the one who was against this and doubted if she would ever fit in. So if the show really wanted to create a romance between these two characters, they could have done so by playing off of these shared experiences. They, for example, could have built off Chakotay trying to appeal to her humanity and embrace her human side as he did in Scorpion. Also, they could have reconnect with Chakotay's experiences and the co-op of former drones, and perhaps have scenes where Chakotay and Seven share a narrow link. Or they could play off of how Chakotay has to eat humble pie about being wrong that Seven could integrate into the crew successfully, and that he was so impressed by how she succeeded that he became enamored with her. So what they should have done was, throughout Season 7, explore this storyline based off of their past experiences and thus planting the seeds of a romance that could have blossomed in the final episode, and thus this romance actually would have worked, and it would have been convincing, and there would have been chemistry between these two characters. But none of that was done. Instead, we got a lot of silly banter between the two of them about Seven learning how to date and what is and is not appropriate for a first or second date. And quite frankly, this type of banter is far more appropriate for the type of relationship that 709 had with the Doctor, and feels entirely out of place with Chakotay. And overall, their relationship was a lot of telling, not showing. How in the future they kept telling us that they were in love, and that Chakotay and 709 were insisting, they were telling us that they were on intimate terms. But what we actually saw on screen didn't come off as two people in love, but two awkward strangers pretending like they were. And what's ironic is the show had the opportunity to foreshadow this, as just 3 episodes prior to the finale, there was an episode called Natural Law, which featured Chakotay and 709 being stranded behind an energy field where they were trapped and forced to interact with a primitive culture. During the filming of that episode, both actors kept asking if they should play up the romantic aspects between the characters, even though these actors still at this stage were unaware of what was planned for the finale. They were basing this simply off of the events of human error. But for some reason, the director and the producers specifically told them not to play off any implied romance in any way, shape, or form. So when they got the script for Endgame and saw there was indeed to be a romance between the two characters, they were super confused as to why this romance was not built up to when they had the opportunity to do so. In fact, Jerry of Nine describes this as one of only 3 regrets she has in her entire time of Voyager, and she wished that she would have foreshadowed 709's feelings towards Chakotay regardless of what the director was telling her to do. So, why they proposed avoiding foreshadowing this romance in order to make it work is beyond me. Perhaps the producers just hate continuity and foreshadowing that much. But unfortunately, foreshadowing and continuity is essential to character development, and character development is essential to telling good character stories, which is what is required if you want character-based storylines like romances to work. So in short, everything about the on-screen romance between 709 and Chakotay, as seen in Endgame, was a failure. Poorly constructed, poorly thought out, and overall horribly executed. Part 5. Alternate Endings. The title of this section doesn't refer to alternate endings of Endgame, but rather alternate endings of Star Trek Voyager as a show. As a common rebuttal I've heard over the years whenever I expressed my dislike of Endgame was, well, they did the best they could, and they couldn't have done any better. However, there exist several examples of how the final episode of Voyager could have been done better. I'll start with the most opaque and obvious example, and that is a pair of novels that came out shortly after Voyager ended that describes the events that occurred after Voyager got home. These novels were called Homecoming and The Farther Shore. These novels are not canon. These two novels, which is two parts to tell one story, were met with mixed reviews. It received an average user rating of 3.91 stars out of 5 on the Goodreads website, but several critics referred to the plot as choppy and all over the place. But many of the reviews of these novels stated the exact thing I thought when reading it, that it was far better ending for the series than Endgame. Now, these novels take place immediately after Voyager returns to Earth and describes how the crew integrates to life on Earth after being gone for so long. This includes Janeway being promoted to Admiral, which is consistent with her cameo in Star Trek Nemesis, and also promotions for Torres, Kim, and Chakotay, who is promoted to Captain of Voyager with Tom Paris as his first officer. It touches on how the former Maquis are received, and also on the difficulty 7 of 9 and each have trying to integrate into the Federation society, where they're met with some bigotry and suspicion, and how the Doctor struggle to be recognized as a sentient being and not just another hologram also begins. All these aspects that should have been touched in the show itself. The novel focuses on 3 plots. The plot of Torres going off to search for her mother who had gone missing, the Doctor having to try to quiet a holographic uprising that turned violent, but the main and most important plot is that of a Borg virus that breaks out on Earth that starts assimilating people. This was the most interesting and well-constructed through story that worked amazingly well to show how 7 of 9 proved herself to Starfleet and show the rest of the Voyager cast working together to deal with the crisis. The Borg outbreak turns out to be a human obsessed with the Borg who is emulating them and trying to turn herself into a new Borg queen and form her own collective. And I thought this was executed really well and made for an exciting story. So, this is the example I referred to earlier that defeats the argument that showing Voyager return home would have been anticlimactic, because these novels show Voyager returning home and resolve all the aspects fans were dying to know of how the crew would be received and what would happen to them, while at the same time telling a suspenseful, engaging story that frankly was better written, had less fundamental flaws than Endgame. The novel shows some characters reconnecting with characters from the past, which explores their backstories in interesting ways, such as Torres trying to reconnect with her mother, Harry Kim reconnects with his former fiancée Libby, who has moved on with her life. But perhaps the best thing the novel does is immediately ends the relationship between 7 of 9 and Chakotay. In fact, it's one of the first things that happen. And I remember when I read that part of the book, I put the book down so I could clap and cheer. It's a sad state of affairs when non-canon novelists know how to write Star Trek better than the actual Star Trek writers. However, we don't have to look outside of canon to find better examples of how Voyager could have returned home much better. In the show itself, there are several episodes where Voyager nearly returns home, but then something happens and where the plan goes wrong and they remain stuck in the Delta Quadrant. So this happens in the episodes of Eye of the Needle, Prime Factors, Cold Fire, Threshold, False Prophets, Hope and Fear, Timeless, and Shattered. Now, Threshold is generally considered the worst episode of Voyager, and therefore I will concede this is a bad example of Voyager returning home, so just as well as they didn't. I already talked about Shattered and how the way they could have returned home by erasing the events that led Voyager to the Delta Quadrant in the first place, which is similar to the method used in Endgame to return home by erasing events of the past. And as I already mentioned, Chakotay made an excellent argument on why this is a bad idea, and thus why this method used in Endgame was a horrible one that we were already told goes against the basic tenets on what the show is about. However, that being said, if they had found a way to get Voyager home in that episode that did not involve erasing the past 7 years, Shattered would have made a far superior finale, as it did a much better job at reconnecting with Voyager's past and giving fans a more concrete story that celebrated the 7-year journey that the whole show is based on. False Prophets also isn't a very good example and would have been too easy of a way for Voyager to return home. It was just through a wormhole. And the plot that episode had, where they had these Ferengi to overcome, it wasn't a very well constructed plot, so this is another bad example. So let's look at the first and second season examples. Eye of the Needle, Prime Factors, and Cold Fire. Now, obviously, Voyager returning home that early in the show would have defeated the whole purpose of the show, and Voyager shouldn't have returned home until at least the 6th season, possibly the 5th, but definitely not the 1st or 2nd. But that doesn't mean these ideas couldn't have been translated to a later date. Now, Eye of the Needle is another wormhole example. However, there are many ins and outs that make this unique. First of all, it leads to Romulan space, which would involve a very fascinating plot of political intrigue that Voyager crew could return to the Alpha Quadrant, but to Romulan space. So they would have to negotiate how to return to the Federation, and the other aspect was, of course, the reason given on why the solution wouldn't work, because the wormhole led to 22 years in the past. Now, this could either be left out so we can focus more on the Romulan plot, or it could be used in a way where instead of just giving out the crew, try to find a way to use it to return home, but then are lost in time. And then they try to find a way to return to their own time. And perhaps they had a plan all along on how to do so, some time traveling method. And thus, we'd get an interesting plot of the Voyager crew interacting with 22 years in the past. Instead of being lost in space, they'd be lost in time. But of course, by the end of the episode, they'd find a way to return to their own time, and thus you would have a much better episode of Voyager returning home that involves time travel. So next, let's look at Prime Factors, where the crew meets up with a group of friendly aliens that just wanted them to relax and enjoy the resort world. However, it's discovered they have a device that is capable of instantly transporting people to locations light years away. So then the crew gets excited at the prospect of adapting this technology to Voyager in order to jump the whole ship several times until they get home. But the aliens themselves had a policy of not sharing technology and refused the request. But there were other elements within this government that were for making a trade that would want to give Voyager this technology. But this sort of split the crew, as Janeway was against dealing with unofficial elements of their government, while others, such as Taurus and Tuvok, felt the opportunity of returning home was too big to pass up on. Now, in this episode, the device ended up being incompatible with Voyager and nearly destroyed the ship when they tried to use it. But what if that wasn't the case? What if the device could have gotten them home? This would create a very fascinating character-based story that plays on the interpersonal politics on board Voyager, which personally I think would be an absolute perfect way to end the series, in a way that pays homage to the show that came before it, while exploring the character dynamics of the show. Now, this episode takes place in the first season, where the allegiances were very obvious, Maquis versus Starfleet, but imagine if this story was transplanted to the 7th season, where the crew alliances are a lot more complex and ambiguous. And to have the crew deal with external and internal politics to where they finally navigate them all and learn to come together to find a way to return home as a team that would be a perfect way for Voyager to end and for Voyager to get home. And then there's Cold Fire, which follows up on the main cliffhanger of the pilot episode, The Caretaker, where there exists another caretaker who was the one who brought them to the Delta Quadrant in the first place, who then, understandably, this other caretaker would be able to send them back to the Alpha Quadrant. In this episode, they find her only to find out that she's evil because she mistakenly believes that they killed the caretaker. But Janeway stops her from destroying the ship and convinces her that they didn't kill the caretaker, but then we never see her ever again. Think of how appropriate it would be if the finale episode of Voyager followed up on that storyline that started the whole show in the first place. After all, it worked extremely well for The Next Generation with All Good Things, which reconnected with its pilot episode. Now, some may make the argument that Voyager had moved beyond this storyline, therefore to revisit it for the finale would seem out of place. However, the incident with the caretaker had been referenced several times, even towards the end of Voyager's run, most notably in the episode The Voyager Conspiracy, where the events of the caretaker were revisited, and in fact it was suggested there was more to this incident than what was earlier thought. This was never followed up on in this episode, but what if there was a finale that revisited the events of the caretaker that followed up on the long overdue abandoned storyline of Suspiria? This is actually something many fans had suggested, as it would make a lot of sense for Voyager to end by reconnecting with its roots, just like All Good Things did. And I would argue it could have been done in a way that stayed consistent with what Voyager had become in its 7th season. In fact, the juxtaposition between the 1st and 7th season would have been fascinating, just like it was in All Good Things. So, that leaves Hope and Fear and Timeless. And the two episodes are connected as the method of getting home is the same, the slipstream drive. Now, in Hope and Fear, they apparently found a message from Starfleet that led them to a Starfleet ship capable of slipstream drive that Starfleet sent them in order for the Voyager crew to get home. However, it is later discovered that this ship wasn't sent by Starfleet, but was in fact part of an alien deception meant to send the crew to the Borg to get assimilated. However, the slipstream drive was real, and Voyager attempted to recreate it for its own engines, which they attempt to use in the episode Timeless. But the experiment fails, resulting in Voyager's destruction, which is then reversed due to interventions from a future version of Harry Kim. Now, I will say that if this Starfleet slipstream drive ship turned out to be genuine and not an alien deception, that would have been a boring way for Voyager to get home, so let's instead look at Timeless, as this episode is actually really similar to Endgame. In fact, it's probably the episode where Voyager nearly got home that bears most resemblance to how Voyager actually did get home, and Endgame, as both are examples of a crew member from the future intervening and changing the timeline so that Voyager can get home, although in Timeless, future Harry Kim fails to get Voyager home, but succeeds at preventing its destruction. However, Timeless is one of my all-time favorite Voyager episodes, and is in fact in my top 10 favorite episodes of Voyager, and generally speaking, is one of the most beloved episodes by fans. So, if the method of returning home is similar, what makes these episodes so different? Well, first of all, the huge, major difference that makes future Harry Kim's motivation more believable is that the entire crew of Voyager died in his timeline, whereas in Endgame, most of the crew got home and are alive and well. In fact, Voyager fared way better in these 16 imaginary years than they did in the 7 real years that we saw. And Admiral Janeway's motivation for changing the timeline hinged entirely on her personal feelings to her two close friends, which, as I already covered in this video, is very, very crummy motivations to have that make Admiral Janeway a horrible, selfish person. However, in the case of future Harry Kim, he had to live with the deep regret that he was responsible for all of his friends' dying, the entire crew being killed, in fact. So rather than it being an act of selfishness, as it was in Endgame, it was a powerful redemptive arc with an immensely gratifying payoff, even if Voyager didn't get home. And by the way, Harry Kim wasn't giving the Borg access to futuristic weapons that would make them a lot more powerful. Just as, FYI, just to let you know. But just imagine how gratifying the payoff would have been had Voyager got home in Timeless. I dare say that had Timeless ended with Voyager getting home and was in fact the 2-hour series finale, it would likely be my favorite Voyager episode of all time, as opposed to Endgame, which was my least favorite episode of all time. So in short, the argument that the series ending couldn't have been done better is a provable falsehood, as there are many specific examples that already exist, be it the Homecoming novels or even earlier episodes of Voyager had they been slightly tweaked, that are much better examples of what the Voyager series finale could have been. Part 6. The one scene I liked. So I do have to admit that not all of Endgame was terrible. There were a few aspects about it that I liked, such as when Voyager was in the transwarp hub when they were attacked by the Borg, and Tuvok announced the only safe route for them to get out of it led back to the Delta Quadrant, which made you think this would be yet another, we almost got home episode. But then Janeway actually finds a way to say, screw that, and gets them back to the Alpha Quadrant anyway. That was actually a very gratifying fake out. And also, when they made contact with Starfleet, seeing Harry Kim's reaction was the only gratifying thing about seeing them get home. Garrett Wang is an amazing actor, and we knew Harry Kim in particular was the most eager to get home, and to see him all teary-eyed and in awe almost made you happy that Voyager finally got home. But the main thing about this episode I think actually worked was one scene towards the start of the episode where Tuvok was playing Calto with Icheb. In this scene, Harry Kim tries to indicate which move Icheb should make, but Tuvok points out that Kim never beat him at Calto, so Icheb should make his own mind. So Icheb makes that move anyway, and he ends up winning the game. Now, this scene was intended to serve the function of showing Tuvok was starting to succumb to his disease that we know he gets in the future, but really it serves more functions than that. First of all, this is the only appearance of Icheb in this episode, a character who's been important throughout Season 7, and yet we never really learn what happens to him and how returning to Earth affects him, as this is his only appearance in this episode. In fact, I get the impression this was thrown in there just to give him a cameo, when really he should have factored in more. Regardless, we get this great interaction with him in a recreational situation with other crew members, which is really cool to see. I just wish we got more of him in this episode. But more importantly, this is a nice callback to what happened in Voyager before, as it features the game Calto, which is a Vulcan game first introduced in the 3rd season of Voyager. And the fact that Harry Kim constantly plays Tuvok as a reference to a 3rd season storyline where Kim asks Tuvok to help him purge his emotions just like a Vulcan. An interesting storyline, even if it was from a horrible episode. And so Kim and Tuvok's tendency of playing this game was always a nice callback to that, so it was great to get a mention of this in the finale. I have no doubt the scene was written by Kenneth Biller or Brennan Braga, that they somehow managed to slip in an actual creative piece that pays homage to what came before. I only wish they got in more scenes like this, that they could have explored relationships like Tuvok and Kim's more, and that they explored each have interacting with the other crew more. It ultimately is a small snippet of how good this finale could have been had it been in the hands of more capable writers. Conclusion. Endgame, the finale episode of Star Trek Voyager, was a failure in every sense of the term. Fans have waited 7 years to see the crew of Voyager meet their ultimate goal of returning home, a goal that has been repeatedly stated throughout the show's 7-year run, and that's something that the crew wanted very badly. But when it came time to finally accomplish this goal and give the audience the long-term payoff they've longed for so long, the crew all of a sudden were not interested in returning home and seemed more content to stay in the Delta Quadrant, which was an extremely poorly timed change in attitude, to say the least. And also, the main goal of the episode wasn't, in fact, to return home. The motivation was shoved to the side in favor of a fake stake that involved a storyline that made the Borg unrealistically invincible and was completely incompatible with all established lore involving the Borg, a goal that, unlike returning home, audiences had little to no reason to care about. And this was accomplished through the interference of a future version of Janeway doing what the show had already established on several occasions was immoral and wrong and an undesirable thing to do, and that is changing the past in order to get Voyager home. The future Janeway's motivations for doing so were completely selfish in nature, as it involved the safety of her two closest friends, while disregarding promising young officers, devoted members of the crew, and family men who gave their lives so Janeway and the others could live, but she had no regard for them, nor the billions of lives in the Delta Quadrant who would no doubt be negatively affected by Janeway erasing 16 years of history. This was all accomplished in a poorly constructed script that introduced completely irrelevant side plots and threw in popular, proven moneymakers such as time travel, the Borg, the Klingons, and Lieutenant Barclay, and a forced, failed, lifeless, and contrived romance between two main characters who have no chemistry between them whatsoever, regardless of whether or not it was conducive to telling a good story or celebrating the show's 7-year run, which is what any good finale should do. Instead of being a creative work of art like The Next Generation or Deep Space Nine's finale, Endgame was a business formula written by a business executive with no experience in creative writing, whereas there exists several examples in the form of non-canon novels and previous episodes on how Voyager could have returned home in a way that was satisfying to audience and celebrated what the show had accomplished. In short, Endgame was a horrible disaster, and I maintain is in fact the worst episode of Voyager and the worst series finale ever to air on television. Thank you so much for watching my video essay on Endgame and why it is a failure. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to check out the rest of my channel, as I do many more Star Trek videos, including individual episode reviews as selected by my viewers and various Star Trek top 10 lists, and I am currently close to finishing my season by season reviews of Star Trek Voyager, where I review every episode of Star Trek Voyager one season at a time. I also cover many other shows such as Game of Thrones, The Expanse, Mr. Robot, and more, so please be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.